Hi, my name is Katie McInnes. I'm a senior at Whitworth and I'm studying health science.
Hi, my name is Bella Mazza. I am a pre-nursing major.
And my name is Jaylee Graham, and I am a history and secondary education major.
And this is, I'm Professor Anthony Clark, and this is a class on the history of Christianity in Asia, mostly China. And we are here to talk about, what are we talking about?
The Bible in China.
The Bible in China and Protestants, right? Okay, well, let's get going.
All right. So the Bible in China is a fascinating and challenging story that lasts over several centuries. This encompasses interactions between Chinese culture, foreign missionaries, and the spread of Christianity. The Bible in China has slowly evolved from early encounters in China, making foreign Christian communities to more widespread translations and changes in the modern world. History of missionary activity, cultural exchange, and political challenges led to the growth of Christians in China. From the early Nestorian Christians to the Jesuit missionaries and the Protestant translations later on, the Bible has been an important part of China's growth with Christianity. Today, the Bible continues to have a significant role in Chinese Christian communities despite the ongoing restrictions from China's government faced by Christians in the country. Not only does the Bible have significant religious meaning to Christians in China, but it also opened doors to the field of sinology and the exchange of Western cultures with China.
All right, so we have, I think, anywhere from 3 to 5 questions. Let's start our first question.
All right, so the first question is, what is the history of the Bible and Christianity in China? So with that, Christianity was first brought to China in the 6th century by the Nestorian Christians, or a church from the East. These individuals were Christians sent to China to influence local beliefs and conform to Christianity. This was all within the Tang Dynasty. Slowly, a small church community of Nestorians was formed. This group of missionaries focused on engagement within the Chinese culture. They thought that they could gain respect and through local participation if they engaged within the Chinese culture. The idea was also circulating that the Chinese scholars should convert to Christianity. Many missionaries tried their best to interact with the children and adults of China, trying to show their efforts into their lifestyles. Matteo Ricci was a Jesuit missionary who was known for cultural adaptation and gaining mutual respect. He assisted with the understanding of Western culture to the Chinese. As the global missionary movement continued to progress, so did the amount of missionaries in China. The Opium War, opening of the ports for foreign trade of 1839 to 1841, pushed a greater movement of missionaries into China. Robert Morrison was a key figure during this time. Morrison came to China as a Protestant missionary. Morrison's goal was to overcome the cultural divide amongst the Chinese and Westerners. He was well aware of the language barrier. With this being the barrier that he faced, he translated the Bible into Chinese and also created a dictionary to better communicate between the two parties. This was one of the first bridges between the societies. The Chinese now had a Bible they could follow and understand. Morrison published his first translation of the New Testament in 1813 and the Old Testament in 1819. Translating the Bible was important for the missionary standpoint on spreading the Word of God. The Bible was first published in classical Chinese. Not all common individuals would understand this translation. To convert people into Christianity, the Bible needed to be understood by all, including the common folk of Chinese. The Bible also needed to be accessible for everyone. A key way this goal could be accomplished by missionaries was to open up schools. This way they could educate the Chinese youth with the Christian messages and ideas being brought to China. Many of these schools also taught English as well as Western science ideas. In addition to starting schools in China, missionaries were also famous for starting orphanages for abandoned children and raising them through a Christian background. Babies that were abandoned or left on the street were taken to the orphanages with open arms. The missionaries also played a great role in hospitals and early medicine in China. This is where Western and Chinese medicine collide. Missionaries took two approaches: learning and adapting to Chinese culture or maintaining a Western viewpoint. The tensions were heightened if one chose to follow the idea of more of a Western approach, and understandably so. A language barrier can also affect more than just words, but values and expressions, as discussed prior. Chinese citizens quickly became skeptical of missionaries' work. Christianity was seen as a Western religion and not a Chinese one. When the Second Opium War broke out in 1856, China was forced to open their ports yet again. Like the first Opium War, the ports were open to foreigners. Many Chinese viewed this as a disadvantage. As a result, many new and different Western ideas began pouring into China. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901 was a large drawback for Christians. Anti-imperialist, anti-Christian, and anti-foreign actors burned down churches, killing foreigners, and even the native Chinese Christians. Foreign countries had to step in and save China. This was where the 8-nation alliance, Japan, Russia, Britain, France, United States, Italy, and Austria, came in. Troops were sent in to restore order. It was in 1900 that the alliance came to Beijing and destroyed the Boxers. At this point, many missionaries were pushing for church leadership to be more native Chinese. Missionaries wanted Christians of China to take control of their own churches. This led to the three self-patriotic movement. Churches would then be self-governing, supporting, and propagating. In a sense, China would control the Christian religion that was presented. The China Christian Council also had control in this aspect as well. China was greatly afraid of a large group gathering because it possibly could take over China culturally and warp its ideas and values. So in order to stop the possibility of this occurring, China created barriers to keep the spread of Christianity to a minimum. Christian groups were able to meet as long as they followed these strict guidelines. Many churches would meet in hiding so that they could follow their own biblical ideas. In these private spaces, Christians could express their true faith and values. Chinese Christians were able to implement their own culture instead of just following Western styles. The Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949 put a stop to Protestant missionaries. During this time, they were forced to leave the country. Christianity was seen as suspicious, a Western imperialism. Religious practices were restricted and even against the law. Around the 1950s, the government closed churches, missionary schools, and anything Christian related. From this point on, church services were monitored by the Chinese government. During the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976, churches were again destroyed. The government aimed to get rid of all foreign influence, including Christianity. Many Christians were prosecuted. The Chinese government saw Christianity as a threat to their values, and house churches were forced to become even more discreet. Christians had the option to practice, but only could do so under government supervision. Today in China, the growth in Christians has gone from 1 million to 100 million. Christianity is not technically illegal, however, it is highly censored and controlled. Even with this, many communities find it easier to meet in a private rather than a party-controlled and monitored churches. That way, Christians can practice and express their faith in whatever way they want. The rules do not have to be followed because it is not a church service, legally speaking. Within the Chinese government structures, churches only have times that they can meet. Some pastors even have to submit their sermons to make sure it's approved. The Bible is a popular source for the Chinese to side with, despite its challenges. Through these challenges, the Bible is a key source of transformation, hope, and inspiration. China is a place with a clash between tradition and modern society. Unfortunately, the Bible is stuck in between.
So thank you for that. You offer some interesting context, right? So you basically run us through the Opium Wars, the Boxer Uprising. You talk about the 8 allied nations that essentially restore peace in 1900. You talk about this China Christian Council. You even bring us into the post-1949 era, which is this this entrance of Protestant Catholic Christianity into the communist period, right? You talk about the Three Self movement. That's a lot of information, right? And you mentioned, and I just want to underline this before we go to our next question. You mentioned this hugely controversial claim that Christianity was not Chinese, right? But Buddhism is not Chinese either. So that's always the debate. The debate is, if Buddhism comes from India, why can't Christianity also be accepted, which comes from the Middle East? And added to that, right, you talk about these Nestorian Christians who come in the 600s. That's really an incredibly important point, because suddenly you have Christianity in China from the 600s all the way to the present. So a lot of really good information. The Bible is in there. Let's go to the next question, see if we can get more centered on the Bible itself.
Yeah, so our next question is, what were the effects that the Bible Translation Project had on Chinese Christians and also on Chinese culture as a whole? And so we kind of talked about already, we know that Christianity was first brought to China in the 6th century, but it wasn't until later, or earlier in the 1800s that the New Testament was fully translated, and then later the entire Bible by Robert Morrison. And there were several problems with Morrison's Bible, such as just language barriers, cultural barriers, and also theological issues that were brought up during the process of the translation. And so obviously later versions of the Bible were developed, like the most popular one, which is the Chinese Union Bible, which was created in 1919. And since then, that has become one of the most prominent and widely accepted translations of the Bible in the Chinese language.
Can you tell us who was the translator of the Union version?
I actually don't know that.
Okay, you know what?
It was a project by a big group of people.
Yeah,
so,
right. So, here's the silly thing. I'm the professor of this class. I've forgotten. This is a significant point, right? Because Morrison is going to be the first to finish.
Right.
Right, and then you have the Union version, and more people say, I just don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, well, listeners to this podcast, send us some kind of message and fix us. Keep going.
Yeah, so while the Bible Translation Project was fundamentally a religious undertaking, its impact on Chinese society extended far beyond religion, which influenced language, education, literature, social reform, and even politics. The Bible Translation Project brought about a deeper understanding of Western Christian theology to China, which was a region historically dominated by Confucianism, Buddhist, and Taoist traditions. So concepts such as monotheism, sin, redemption, salvation, and the afterlife were all very foreign concepts to Chinese thought before the arrival of Christianity. And as missionaries and scholars worked to translate the Bible into Chinese, these new ideas were introduced, which sparked a lot of intellectual and cultural exchange between the China and West of thinking about how do we think about what this means in Western culture, and then how do we also translate that over to Chinese culture. And the most influential piece of text that emerged as a result of the Bible Translation Project was the Chinese Union Bible, which is commonly known as, and we'll refer to as, the CUV. And it had a very simple word structure that was created for all people to be able to understand. This version of the Bible is one that people from all socioeconomic backgrounds were able to understand, which was impactful because it created a way for the Word of God to be presented to them in terms and in the language that was native to them. So they didn't have to rely on bishops, missionaries, priests, or local churches to decipher what the Bible was. They were able to hold the text in their own hands and kind of develop their own sense of understanding of God, Christianity, and the Christian gospel, which allowed them to kind of have a deeper and more personal relationship with God and with their faith. And it also allowed them to develop forms of Christianity that were not dependent on missionaries and foreign churches, but rather their own interpretations of the Bible and how it applies to them in their Chinese society. And not only did the development of the CUV make the gospel accessible to Christians across China, but it also helped unite them. Because during the time that the CUV was born, there was a great cultural and linguistic revolution that was happening in China. And it was a time where the old literary language was finally abandoned and replaced by what is now known as vernacular Mandarin, which is kind of the language that is spoken by all government officials and educated people throughout China. And this dialect enabled people from different places whose local dialects were different, similar to like in America how we have different words, phrases, sayings across the countries. They have that too.
This is a really significant point.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add to that, though, that dialectical differences here are we can more or less understand each
Mm-hmm.
other. Myself being born and raised in Oregon, lived in Alabama for a while, I can mostly figure out what everyone was
Right.
saying. Sometimes I wonder if they done, that I had more of the accent than they did. But in China, sometimes they absolutely are mutually unintelligible.
Right.
That is, cannot speak with each other.
Yeah.
So
So this kind of allowed them to communicate with each other in a common language and to read the Bible in a common language, which united different groups of Christians from across China who were understanding the Bible in different ways. They now had one common text to unite each other with. And so it helped foster a sense of unity and community among Chinese Christians who up until then had been super limited by their ability to share religious texts and worship practices due to these linguistic barriers. And prior to the CUV, Christian texts were available in lots of different translations, But they often used classical Chinese, which was difficult for a lot of ordinary people to understand. And in some cases, some of the small like mission-related translations were kind of like fragmented and limited in scope. So maybe it wouldn't have the full Bible translations. It would just have snippets from each book and stuff like that. And so the introduction of this Bible made, it allowed believers, regardless of their regional backgrounds, to engage with the scriptures and a writing system that they could all understand. And this accessibility was not only a tool for personal spiritual growth, but it also helped bind Christian communities together. The shared use of the CUV in worship services, Bible studies, Christian gatherings created a sense of cohesion and solidarity among Chinese Christians, who, despite their differences, could now unite around a common faith expressed in a common writing system. And additionally, the efforts to translate the Bible into Chinese played a key role in the development of sinology, which is the academic study of China, its culture, language, and history, thus helping bridge the gap between Western and Chinese intellectual traditions. So the primary goal to translate the Christian text, particularly the Bible, into Chinese, but in doing so, they inadvertently contributed to the rise of sinology, because the Bible translation required a very deep understanding of the Chinese language, culture, and philosophical systems, which prompted missionaries to immerse themselves in Chinese texts, which they might not have done otherwise. And so they were reading classical Chinese philosophy and history and works from other religions as well in their attempts to translate the Bible. And it really opened a door to a more systematic study of Chinese civilization as a whole, which we now know as the academic discipline of sinology. And so translating Christian texts into Chinese required them to also understand Chinese grammar, syntax, and their idiomatic expressions. And so they often collaborated with local scholars to create new terms for Christian concepts, which later became a part of the Chinese lexicon. In doing so, they helped standardize the written Chinese language, influencing both the creation of modern written Chinese and the development of scholarly texts on Chinese history and culture. And there were also many non-English speaking nations, such as France and Germany, who had their own sinological practices and traditions at this time, but the introduction of Morrison's work kind of paved the way for the field of sinology to be brought to English-speaking countries like America and Britain.
This last point, we made a lot of good points here, Jaylee, but this last point was a really interesting one because when we think about Protestant history globally, the whole study of literature is highly influenced by Protestantism, who made this extraordinarily diligent effort to understand Scripture and created exegetical studies, hermeneutical studies. So most of us who have studied literature in our life have a massive debt to Protestant biblical studies. But you make this interesting point that these English-speaking Bible translations fed into English sinology and new ways of practicing sinology, which is really what the study of China. So, but doing so in a way that goes deeply into the meaning of words and text. So the point I like that you made there, right, is this effort influences the intellectual world way outside of just the religious history in China. It influences how everyone thinks about China, right? Okay, Bella.
Okay. So, how did the missionaries use themes of the Bible to spark sociocultural reform? This one definitely can take us a long time to dive into, but ultimately some main takeaways was that I took at least was that when missionaries, specifically American Protestant missionaries, went to China, they made large strides to change certain Chinese cultural norms, but obviously without trying to step on too many toes. And so part of the issues with translating the Bible was not only finding the right words, but being able to explain it in a way that is understood. And so having not necessarily a direct translation, but one that can be understood. So when they went to China, they had realized that the conversation and education of the Chinese locals would be much more difficult than they had all originally anticipated. This was due to the massive amounts of class inequality and sexism seen in the mainstream culture of the Chinese. One example was that girls were often pushed aside by society as they were not seen as inherently valuable as boys were, especially in rural areas where hard labor was needed to feed mouths. This is seen from a historical standpoint, and then therefore girls would sometimes become socially and financially perceived as a burden onto a family. Thus, hence why the American Protestant missionaries made such large efforts to try and shift the Chinese cultural expectations and rules in a more positive direction. By desiring to do this, they set up efforts and systems to actively fight against the cycle the missionaries were seeing. One example of their effective attempts was the promotion of educating young girls. They needed more people to be educated so that they could comprehend and read the Word of God and therefore potentially secure their salvation and truthfully become closer to God. One of the reasons, as discussed in class, was during the race against other branches of Christianity to quote-unquote gain souls for their branches, the war on souls. And so one way to do this was to educate the population being targeted so that they could read and understand the practices and readings of the church. Another great feat against early customs was the success of almost abolishing in total the practice of foot binding. Again, this practice was sexist in the view of the modern day, but back then, and in non-Western context culture, it was a custom done in anticipation to secure a good and wealthy husband to give their daughters to. Having the restriction and stunted growth of the feet beyond being a beauty standard was to show that the family didn't need to depend on their daughter's ability to work, like in a field, for example. This was a way to flaunt the economic and social status of the family. Lastly, the missionaries, in doing both of these things, started orphanages to help the discarded girls and some boys as well. The orphanages became centers for development and empowerment. Missionaries would feed, clothe, engage in games, and educate the children. These places became areas for revolution as tides of reform started to move. As mentioned by Professor Clark, the short hair of women at this time was a huge catalyst for the feminist revolution in China later on, and the missionaries encouraged it. Such an act of rebellion, even if seemingly small to the modern-day Westerner, would eventually snowball into the base of movement towards gender-based equality supported by values in the Bible.
So one thing that really strikes me about this is how many of us. Oh, by the way, I should add that there are 4 of us at the table here, but there's a whole classroom here listening, and we just haven't done this. In the last podcast, they gave us an applaud as we started, so you have to give us an extra nice applaud after we finish. But one of the things that you wouldn't expect typically I think is connecting education or connecting social activism to the translation of the Bible. But one particularly unique practice of the Protestant mission is that in order to render the Bible accessible to people, they had to be literate. And to make them literate, they had to be educated. So there's this very powerful connection between an education and being able to access the Bible, right? So what does that do? That means that Protestants are opening way more schools than actually, Catholics at this period in the 19th century way outnumbered the Protestants. But Protestant schools way outnumbered Catholic schools. So Protestant schools became this really significant influence over society because not only were they educating them to read so they could access the Bible, but they were educating them in Western ways of thinking about social issues such as foot binding, social issues such as arranged marriages, social issues such as the equality of men and women. And those are the kinds of things that you see happening, especially in Protestant schools. And largely because of this ideal that the Bible needs to be read, right? So I like how you make that connection. What we're going to do now, though, is, and you might not have anything else, right? But we're at that magic moment where we should probably close up. Do you have anything else you want to add, each of you, just about the Bible as it was formed? Maybe is there anything else, I guess, last chance to say something on this podcast that trillions of people will listen to?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, just, kind of to not really boil it down, but being able to translate things, especially back then when obviously things like the internet weren't there, globalization, was still occurring, but not quite to the point where it is now. Really putting in that work to not only understand the people that they're trying to, expose Christianity to, but being able to have them understand them. So that exchange in of itself is really complex, but ultimately
you can't explain something to someone if they can't understand how you're doing it, right? And so just from the basis of integrating not only the Westerners into some Chinese culture to better present things to them, people were later on able to more understand the Western point of view in some aspects as well due to that.
Right. And, you know, whether or not you're within or without of any kind of religious community, the Bible does serve as a kind of cultural bridge because it's that central thing for a lot of these Westerners who are in China. Anything else?
I think it's also a really beautiful thing to say that, like, the Bible translation project didn't stop with Robert Morrison's Bible, and it didn't stop with the creation of the Chinese Union Version Bible. And in the same way that in America and English-speaking countries, we have almost hundreds of different versions of translations. Like, we have the NIV, we have the ESV, we have
RSV,
the King James Version, like, list goes on and on. China has the same thing, and so the Bible has continued to become developed, and it has continued to change, and it's desired, it's wanted, it's seeked, and it's just been a really cool thing that has continued to grow and grow. Even in spite of so many restrictions on Christianity, they have still found a way to progress the movement of Bible translation forward.
Right, that's a good point. And we talked about this before we began the podcast, and that is the fact that these translators were not only looking at the English translations or French translations, they're looking at Hebrew and Greek.
Yeah.
So these Western translators they're basically translating into Chinese the same way with the Hebrew and Greek version that people are translating into English, and struggling with what word best fits the meaning of this original word, like logos.
Yeah.
In John, right? How do we translate,
God.
And 4
how do we
different
translate the
alphabets,
logos?
too. Like,
Right.
that's just insane.
So anyway, thank you. That was a great joy. We are going to end, but we're not going to end without a kind of applause from the class. Yes. All right. All right. Thanks, everyone. All right. Thank you.